There is a very clear biological reason for what you are feeling. When the mind remains overloaded for long enough, the body begins to conserve energy. It slows down, it reduces strength, it lowers motivation, it cuts momentum. Not because you became weak, but because your system entered protection mode. This is the point many people do not realize. The feeling of physical weakness, the difficulty starting simple tasks, the lack of energy for things that used to be normal, are often not a lack of discipline, nor a lack of willpower. They are signs of mental exhaustion. And this exhaustion is not only emotional, it is physiological, it is neurological, it is energetic. The human brain consumes about 20% of the body's total energy, even though it represents a small fraction of body weight. This means that thinking, deciding, monitoring, worrying, planning, analyzing, and staying alert consume real fuel: glucose, oxygen, neurotransmitters. And when this consumption happens continuously, for days or weeks, the system begins to adapt. It tries to preserve resources. It tries to avoid collapse. It tries to guarantee survival. So it reduces activity, reduces speed, reduces willingness. This may look like weakness, but biologically, it is conservation. You may have noticed this recently. You wake up already tired. You start the day with little energy. You look at a simple task and feel a strange resistance. Not laziness, not a lack of character, but a real difficulty. As if the body were heavy, as if the mind were slow, as if everything required too much effort. And this can create concern, because when energy drops, the first interpretation is usually negative. Something is wrong with me. I am losing ability. I am becoming weak. But there is another explanation. An explanation that makes sense from the perspective of neuroscience and physiology. The human nervous system operates based on balance. It needs to alternate between activity and recovery, between effort and rest, between alertness and relaxation. This balance is called homeostasis. When the system remains in a state of alert for too long, that balance breaks. The body enters a state called allostatic load. This means it is sustaining a high level of activation for an extended period, and maintaining that state requires energy, a lot of energy. The problem is that the body was not designed to stay in continuous alert. It was designed to respond to temporary threats, resolve the problem, and then recover. But in modern life, threats rarely disappear completely. They transform. Financial worries, professional responsibilities, constant decisions, messages, expectations, uncertainty. None of this is an immediate physical threat, but the brain reacts as if it were. It activates the stress system. It releases cortisol. It increases vigilance. It maintains heightened attention. And when this happens for too long, the system begins to wear down. Not dramatically, but gradually, silently, persistently. First comes difficulty concentrating. Then, irritability appears. Then comes the feeling of constant fatigue. Then the sensation of weakness appears. And this sequence is not random. It follows a physiological pattern. When the brain remains activated, it consumes neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine at an elevated rate. These substances are responsible for mental energy, motivation, focus, and reward sensation. When their levels drop, the subjective experience changes. Tasks feel harder, decisions feel heavier, effort feels greater, not because you lost ability, but because the system has fewer resources available. Imagine a phone with a low battery. It continues working, but performance decreases. Apps become slower. Screen brightness is reduced. Some functions are disabled, not because the device is broken, but because it needs to preserve energy. The human body does something very similar. When resources decrease, it reduces activity, reduces initiative, reduces intensity. This is a protection mechanism. Another important factor is the role of the prefrontal cortex. This region of the brain is responsible for planning, decision-making, self-control, and reasoning. It is highly sensitive to fatigue. When the brain is exhausted, this area functions less efficiently. This means tasks that require organization, focus, and discipline become harder. You try to concentrate, but the mind drifts. You try to start a task, but you feel resistance. You try to make a decision, but everything feels confusing. And this can be interpreted as weakness, but in reality, it is a temporary limitation of resources. There is also an important hormonal component. When stress is prolonged, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis remains active. This system regulates cortisol production. Cortisol is essential for dealing with challenges, but elevated levels over long periods have side effects. They interfere with sleep, reduce recovery, increase inflammation, affect metabolism, and decrease available energy. This creates a cycle. Less recovery generates more fatigue. More fatigue generates more effort. More effort generates more stress. More stress generates less energy, and the body enters a state of progressive wear. Another relevant phenomenon is cognitive fatigue. When the brain needs to process large amounts of information continuously, efficiency decreases. This happens because neural circuits need time to restore themselves. Without sufficient recovery, communication between neurons becomes less efficient. The result is mental slowness, difficulty focusing, a sensation of heaviness in the head, and low motivation. This state can even affect the physical body, because the brain regulates movement, regulates posture, regulates muscular energy. When the central system is tired, the body responds by reducing performance. This explains why mentally exhausted people often report weakness, heaviness in the body, lack of energy, difficulty getting out of bed, a feeling of a slow body. This is not imagination. It is not exaggeration. It is physiology. There is also the role of low-grade inflammation. Prolonged stress can increase inflammatory substances in the body. These substances interfere with brain function. They reduce energy, affect mood, and increase the sensation of fatigue. This process is known in medicine as sickness behavior. When the body detects inflammation, it reduces activity, it induces rest, it lowers motivation. This happens to allow recovery, but when inflammation becomes chronic, the feeling of fatigue persists. Another important point is sleep. The brain recovers during deep sleep. This is when neurotransmitters are restored, memories are organized, metabolic toxins are removed. If sleep is insufficient or fragmented, recovery does not happen completely. The result is accumulated exhaustion. Even if you sleep enough hours, if the sleep is not restorative, the brain remains tired, and when the brain remains tired, the body responds. It reduces energy, reduces strength, reduces willingness. All of this can create a worrying sensation. You look at yourself and think, I am different, I am slower, I am weaker. But maybe the more accurate question is, how long has my system been operating without pause? Because mental exhaustion does not appear overnight. It is built over time. Through continuous pressure, constant responsibility, prolonged vigilance, repeated worry, and lack of adequate recovery. And here is an important message. You are not weak, you are tired. And there is a fundamental difference between weakness and exhaustion. Weakness is incapacity. Exhaustion is overload. Weakness is permanent limitation. Exhaustion is a temporary state. Weakness is absence of strength. Exhaustion is excessive use of strength. When you understand this, something changes. Guilt decreases. Judgment decreases. Self-criticism decreases. You begin to see your own state more clearly. You realize the problem is not lack of character, not lack of discipline, not lack of willpower. It is lack of recovery. And recovery is not a luxury. It is a biological necessity. The nervous system needs pauses. The brain needs rest. Neural circuits need time to reorganize. Without that, performance drops, and the body reacts. Another relevant aspect is motivation. Motivation is not only emotional, it is neurochemical. It depends on dopamine. When the brain is exhausted, dopamine release decreases. This reduces initiative, reduces interest, reduces pleasure. and creates the feeling of discouragement. Not because you lost purpose, but because the system lacks enough energy to sustain enthusiasm. This explains why activities that used to be easy now feel difficult. It is not lack of will. It is lack of fuel. This understanding changes the approach. Instead of pushing yourself harder, you begin to recover better. Instead of demanding more from yourself, you begin to preserve energy. Instead of fighting your body, you begin to cooperate with it. And this change is fundamental because an exhausted system does not respond well to pressure. It responds to recovery. It responds to rest. It responds to reduced load. It responds to safety. And when the system begins to recover, the signals change. Clarity returns. Energy comes back. Motivation reappears. The body strengthens, not instantly, but progressively, gradually, consistently. And this brings a new understanding. The sensation of weakness is not an enemy. It is a signal, an alert, a message from the body, an indication that resources need to be restored. Ignoring that signal can prolong the wear. Listening to that signal can accelerate recovery. And perhaps the most important idea is this: you are not broken. You have not lost ability. You are not becoming weak. You are mentally exhausted. And there is a reason for that. Your brain is trying to keep you functioning, even under pressure, even under demand, even under stress. It is trying to protect you. It is trying to preserve energy. It is trying to prevent collapse. And that leads us to a natural question. If the brain reduces energy to protect the body, if exhaustion is a defense mechanism, if apparent weakness is a preservation strategy, then maybe what you are feeling is not failure. Maybe it is protection. And understanding that mechanism changes everything. Because when you realize the system is trying to protect you, you stop fighting it. You begin to collaborate with it. And that collaboration creates recovery, creates stability, creates clarity, creates energy. And that brings us to the next step in this conversation. If mental exhaustion is a protective response, if the brain reduces activity to maintain safety, if the body slows down to preserve resources, then there is an essential question we need to explore. Why does the brain do this? Why does it reduce energy instead of increasing it? Why does it slow down instead of speeding up? Why does it create fatigue instead of strength? The answer lies in a basic principle of biology: survival. And that is exactly what we are going to understand in the next video. How your brain is trying to keep you safe, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it feels confusing, even when it feels like weakness.